All right, as usual, the handouts available on the website. I've also put it in the chat box if you got there in time. Okay, well, this chapter that we're talking about this week is, in my view, the beating heart of Hegel's book. If you understand this chapter, you can see the rest of what goes on in the book as applications of it. If you don't understand what goes on here, I think you can't understand the point that he's aiming to make, the big philosophical move that he's making. It was the last substantive part of the book as he originally conceived it. When he set out to write a book called The Science of the Experience of Consciousness, this reason section was to be the last of those. Its title is Reason, and we're told in the preface, paragraph 24, that reason is purposive agency. This is his account of the nature of intentional action. Now, we're also given a definition of reason in the opening paragraph of this chapter. He says, Die Vernunft ist Bewusstseinsgewissheit aller Realität zu sein. Reason is consciousness's certainty of being all reality. Now, that's the kind of thing when someone says that to you, that you nod politely, try and calm them down, and back slowly towards the nearest exit. I think we'll actually be able to see why someone would say this. It's alarming, and the connection between it and the talk of agency isn't clear on the face of it. But I'm going to read the second pronouncement as saying that the account of agency is going to explain bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism, the two forms that conceptual contents can take, alethic modal objective forms and deontic normative subjective forms. He's going to give us a hylomorphic account of agency that explains how it is that the same structure we find in the content of our thinkings, by which things appear to us, is already present in another form in the reality that's thought about. And that's what he's putting in dramatic terms, I claim, in that opening section. But I think the better guide to at least the topic of the chapter is the remark in paragraph 24, identifying reason with purposive agency. And indeed, I see Hegel as the father of the philosophy of action, in the sense in which Wittgenstein and Anscombe, Charles Taylor and Donald Davidson defined it in the last half of the 20th century. I think no one before Hegel, not even Kant, and no one after him until at least those figures, had as sophisticated an account of intentional agency as Hegel does. And I think doing a compare and contrast between, on the one hand, the account that he inherited, and on the other hand, the contemporary Anglophone philosophy of agency with Hegel's is an illuminating exercise, and I plan to proceed that way. There are two big differences between Hegel's framing of the question of action, what the philosophical issue is that a philosophy of action should address, and the one that we're more familiar with in the 20th century. And that has to do with the largest orienting question that a philosophical theory of agency should be thought of as addressing, and the kind of examples of intentional doings that are treated as paradigmatic. So on the first of those topics, Wittgenstein formulated the defining question of the theory of action as, what is the difference between my raising my arm and my arm just going up? Jennifer Hornsby characterizes the difference between the two alternatives Wittgenstein is offering us as transitive versus intransitive senses of things happening. Transitive, I'm raising my arm. Intransitive, my arm goes up. Hegel, by contrast, is going to understand the framing question as one of identity and difference, getting together the unity and the disparity that, as he says, agency necessarily involves. On the one hand, action is a unity, an identity. Anscombe expresses this aspect of it when she says, I do what happens. The doing is the unity of what I intend and what objectively happens. On the other hand, I never do just all and only what I intend. I always do more than is in my intention, and often enough, I do less. And he wants us to understand those aspects of unity and disparity. That's the framing question for him. And he's going to insist that that unity can't be understood by bolting together independent elements, a subjective element of intention and an objective happening in the world, the consequences of the intending. He's going to insist you've got to start with a unity and analyze it into its components. And remember that that's what he said about cognition too in the introduction session. And he's going to want us to understand the unity of the subjective and objective in cognition in terms of the story he tells us in the reason chapter about the unity of the subjective and the objective in intentional agency. And this is an essential dimension, maybe the principal dimension of Hegel's pragmatism, is that we have to understand this unity with its intrinsic disparity, articulated by its intrinsic disparity, in terms of what happens in practical agency rather than in cognition. And we'll see that he opposes to a traditional picture of intentional action in terms of a causal chain initiated by an intending, an act of mind, and rippling out into the objective world. That sort of picture he contrasts with an intentional perspectival, intentional with an S, perspectival account. The causal chain account, he thinks, is the one that leads you to try and bolt together things that are intelligible independently. The intentional perspectival account is analyzing a unity into its aspects. That's the one he's going to recommend. But the only point I want to register at this stage is where Anglophone 20th and 21st century philosophy of action has as its orienting question, what's the difference between my doing something intentionally and the same thing just happening, or a corresponding event just happening? Hegel is concerned with understanding with our getting together, the sense in which the doing is my doing, the sense in which I'm responsible for it, what Heidegger calls the Jemeinigkeit, the mindness of the doing on the one hand, and the fact that what I do is an event in the objective world on the other hand. How are we to understand the unity of those two aspects? And that's a different framing question than the Anglophone philosophical literature asks. The second difference is that the paradigm for analytic philosophy of action, as Wittgenstein's question indicates, has been punctiform episodic doings. The raising of an arm, in Davidson's extended example, the flipping of a light switch. Whereas for Hegel, the ones that we need to focus on are weightier, more substantive doings that are extended processes. His paradigm of exercises of intentional agency are things like writing a book, building a house, teaching a course, or even teaching a single class, playing a game of chess, or parenting in the sense of what one does, not just the state of being a parent. It's with that sort of doing in mind that Hegel can affirm, as we'll see when we look at the passages that are on the handout, that we are what we do, that what a subject is what the subject does. And this difference between different kinds of, different sorts of examples that we can think of as paradigmatic doings makes a substantial difference to the criteria of adequacy that set the standard for normative assessments of the success of the philosophic explanatory or explicative enterprise. They're what we're to consult to determine whether or not we've provided, as I would put it, an adequate pragmatic metavocabulary in which to discuss intentional agency. So I want to say Hegel's going to give us a theory of agency that is at least as sophisticated as we find in the contemporary, principally Anglophone analytic literature. In some ways, I want to say it's advances beyond Davidson's in particular. But there are these two substantial differences. The framing question on the one hand, and the sort of doings that are paradigmatic. And we'll see this is important. There's a lot more structure to these extended doings. Now, I'm going to claim that Hegel offers an alternative to causal chain accounts of intentional agency that understand actions in terms of a chain that's initiated by an act of mind, continued by the production of usually a movement of the agent's body, which then has consequences in the objective world that ripple out from it. He's going to offer an alternative to that I think is in many ways very close to Davidson's alternative to that, a perspectival and intentional with an S account. So to understand Hegel's view, we need to situate it in opposition to these causal chain accounts. And that distinction is orthogonal to the distinction I've just been mentioning between the difference in framing question and paradigmatic examples that Hegel has, and the ones that structure the contemporary discussion. And the ways in which I'll see Hegel as going beyond the Davidsonian account are, first of all, that he identifies the different aspects in terms of different social normative perspectives. And that's something that Davidson, who distinguishes between the specifications under which a doing is intentional and merely consequential specifications of it, Davidson doesn't see that as a normative social difference, the way Hegel does. And second, Hegel's account is not only socially perspectival, but historically perspectival. The difference between prospective perspectives on the doing and essentially retrospective ones is essential to him. And I'm going to talk about these two. Basically, the two halves of my discussion are going to be about the Davidsonian alternative to a causal chain account and Hegel's social and normative articulation of that in sort of part one, and in part two, the historical recollective understanding of it. And in that second part, I'll discuss the historical perspectival character of agency under three headings. The cycle of perception and action, which is a test operate, test exit cycle, a tote cycle, which is Hegel's successor notion to the experience of cognitive error that we saw already in the discussion of the introduction. That's what you get when you incorporate the experience of practical failure as well as cognitive error into it. So adding this cycle of perception and action as a further development of the notion of the experience of error is the first element. The second is because he's thinking about these more complex doings, things like writing a book or building a house, Hegel builds in at the base of his account of doings the plan structure of intentions. So something we do see in the contemporary literature, but it came only late. And third, it's once we see the historical articulation of this, that we can see how it can form a paradigm for a semantic account of understanding the cognitive relations between appearance and reality, phenomena and noumena, Phrygian sense and reference. These are the things I talk about in chapter 12 of my book. So that's my introduction, and now I want to talk about this alternative that Hegel offers to a causal chain account. And I think a good place to start is with an appreciation of these aspects of unity and disparity that he's talking about. And here it would be helpful if you look along with me at the passages. Let me see if I can bring that. Uh, okay, is that handout visible? Yeah, good. So actually, that's not the one. That's not the one I want. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay, yeah, this one's better. So under the heading of identity, action simply translates an initially implicit being into a being that's made explicit. Action alters nothing. I should say that I'm in these passages jumping around quite a bit and even bringing in passages that are not from the phenomenology. The conventional wisdom is that the place to look for Hegel's theory of agency is in the philosophy of right. I'm bringing some of that material into, and even pieces from the encyclopedia. Action alters nothing and opposes nothing. It's the pure form of a transition from a state of not being seen to one of being seen. And the content which is brought out into the light of daylight and displayed is nothing else but what this action is, already is in itself. So here I think we can see the hylomorphism. Action has one content that from one point of view is inner. It's the content of an intention. From another one, it's the same content out in the light of objective day. The necessity of the action consists in the fact that purpose is related simply to actuality. And this unity is the begriff of action. And the begriff of action requires that these various aspects be grasped in such a way that the content in them remains the same without any distinction. And then he mentions some of the differences that there are and says this unity is the true work, the true doing. So this is the unity of content. He says we've got to be able to make sense of that. On the other hand, agency essentially involves a disparity. There are two aspects possessed by the practical consciousness: intention and the deed, what is meant or intended by the deed, and the deed itself. He talks about the distinction and dichotomy that lie in action as such, and so constitute a stubborn actuality confronting action. The distinction that action implies is that between what is purposed and what is accomplished in the realm of existence. And then action has multiple consequences insofar as it's translated, that's a change of form, into external existence. For the latter, by virtue of the context in external necessity, develops in all directions. These consequences, as the shape whose soul is the end to which action is directed, the purpose with which one has acted, belongs to the action as an integral part of it. But the action, as the end translated into the external world, is at the same time exposed to external forces which attach to it things quite different from what it is for itself and impel it on into remote and alien consequences. The will thus has the right to accept responsibility only for the first set of consequences, since they alone were part of its purpose. And here I've marked the purpose as Vorsatz, because he's going to distinguish between the Vorsatz and the intention, the Absicht. So the simple original nature now splits up into the distinction which action implies. First, it's an end opposed to the reality already given. Then the movement of the end, the transition, the means. And the third moment is the object, which is no longer in the form of an end directly known by the agent to be his own. Remember the Jemeinigkeit, the mineness of it, but is brought out into the light of day and having for him the form of another, something objective. Consciousness, in doing its work, is aware of the antithesis between doing and being, the disparity between notion, concept, begriff, and reality, which lies in its essence, is learnt by consciousness from experience in its work, in what we'll see as the cycle of perception and action. Therefore, consciousness becomes what it is in truth. This is the fundamental contradiction inherent into work. In work, again, yeah, I've repeated that. I see. And then here's maybe the key. Consciousness, therefore, through its experience, in which it should have found its truth, has really become a riddle to itself. The consequences of its deed are not the deeds themselves. What befalls it is, for it, not the experience of what it is in itself. The transition is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence, presented now as the content and essence, and again as the object or outwardly beheld essence of itself. So what he's going to complain about in the theories of agency that he inherited, including Kant's, is that if you conceive of agency in the traditional way, the way that I would say was still traditional, at least when Davidson was writing, inevitably you become a riddle to yourself. Your deeds are not, as performed in the objective world, are not what you meant or intended. You can't properly grasp, you don't have the conceptual tools to articulate the unity of agency in the face of the disparity that action essentially involves. Now, his account of this unity through difference, or of a kind of identity that is the identity of something that is necessarily articulated into distinct, different elements, that's something that we saw initially in the notion of conceptual content as articulated by relations of determinate negation, of material incompatibility from other conceptually contentful items, and said, okay, that was a notion of identity through difference or something like that. This account of the identity of intentional practical doings as a single content taking the two forms of the intent, what's intentional on the side of the subject and what's objective in as the consequences ripple out in objective reality. This is going to be the paradigm of unity in disparity, of identity through difference, in the same way in which I claimed late in the last session, the model of the logical notions of particularity, universality, and individuality, which are basically the subject matter of the science of logic. The concrete paradigm of those, I claimed, was the formation of a recognitive community, the simultaneous synthesis of self-conscious individual selves and the universals that are their recognitive communities by reciprocal recognitive practical attitudes and recognitive practices relating particular desiring organisms. So in each case, there's a sort of concrete model that he's going to abstract these philosophical concepts from. And part of that abstraction here is going to be that we'll understand the identity of content between the subjective appearance of things, what they are for consciousness, and what they are objectively in themselves. In the case of cognition, also on this practical model. So I haven't so far said anything about how we should understand that unity, but I've given you some of the passages in which he's setting that up as the problem. And remember, the contrast with which I began is that's a different, I want to say deeper, way of framing the issue for a theory of agency than Wittgenstein's crystal clear question: what's the difference between my raising my arm and my arm just going up? It's sort of more abstract in terms of unity and disparity, but I think it's richer and we'll see deeper. Anybody want to say anything about that? Okay. What's the view that he thinks leads us to our actions being a riddle, making ourselves a riddle to ourselves, or being unable to get these together? Well, I indicated it's the model of agency as something like a pearl necklace, a series of events, the individual pearls that are strung together by something like causal relations, beginning with an act of will, a volition, an intending, causing, or otherwise occasioning, if cause isn't quite the right term, a bodily movement. In the case Davidson cares about, the bodily movement is the contraction of my finger, and then that rippling out, causing other events, the flipping of the switch, the turning on of the light. In his example, the alerting of the burglar. Thinking of those as individual events in a causal chain. And then, as he says, the connection between those events is external to me. I know what I intended, but after that, it was sort of issued into this alien world, which made of it maybe something completely different than what I expected. The army recruit is at the shooting range and he's aims at the bullseye, and the sergeant says, "So how did you do? How was that shot?" And the recruit says, "Well, it was a bullseye when it left here, Sarge." Yeah, but then what happened to it? What did it turn into? Hegel talks about, uses as, I don't know, an intuition pump, a medieval European saying, a flung stone belongs to the devil when it leaves the thrower's hand. So imagine somebody throwing a stone into a crowd, and maybe it misses everybody, and maybe it hits somebody in the head and kills them. He intentionally threw the stone, but after that, it was literally out of his hands. And what he actually did, whether he killed somebody or not up to him. You can't, that sort of picture is an obstacle to seeing what's done as mine, as my doing. It invites a contraction strategy that says, well, really, what's done in the basic and purest sense of done is just the willing, just the volition, just the intention. And if you think that, you might be tempted to think, well, that's what should be the subject of moral evaluation, because that's all I have control over. Well, it's all I have total control over. Remember the model of pure independence, authority without any dependence, without any corresponding responsibility to something else. That's the only part that's entirely up to me. After that, I have to depend on the world doing me a favor to see whether, how that relates to what's out there, which is not fully mine. And Hegel thinks this is, in a deep sense, an alienating picture of human action that's going to make it unintelligible that the thing that happens objectively in the world can be my doing in the sense we need to understand ourselves, not to be a riddle to ourselves. Now, there's a particularly tempting version of this, a version that has been tempting throughout modern philosophy, really, that's due to Descartes, where we think of volitions as the minimal kind of doing, minimal, purest form of doing, because they're the only kind of thing you can't try to do and fail, is to will this. Say, well, I didn't manage to put the ball through the hoop, which was what I wanted to do, but at least I tried to do that. I succeeded in intending to put the ball through the hoop. There was an act of will on my part, willing the ball to go through the hoop. But after that, it was out of my hands. There's always the possibility that I will fail, that what actually happens will not correspond to what I willed. But there is one kind of thing where that gap between trying and succeeding can't get a grip. And that's on the willing itself, on the trying. So think of those as the minimal kind of doing. We have indefeasible dominion, complete sovereignty of our will over our will. That's as far as it goes. It doesn't extend any further out in the causal chain, but that we have. And in Descartes, this is absolutely parallel on the practical side to the way he thought about the cognitive side. On the cognitive side, appearings are the minimal, purest kind of knowing. Because I may not know how things really are. I could always be mistaken. But I know how they appear to me. When you ask me, well, is the tower there in the distance round or square? And I say, well, I don't know how it really is, but I know it looks round. So I guess it looks square to me. That I can't be wrong about. I can't be wrong about how it looks or seems to me. Maybe it isn't really. Maybe it isn't really square. There's room for a mistake there. Maybe it only seems to me to be square. But there isn't the same possibility of a mistake about the seemings. It doesn't make sense to ask, well, does it really seem square to you, or does it only seem to seem square? Look to look square to you. And so Descartes says, well, let's take these appearings. Those are things that we know about immediately. There's no possibility of error about knowing about those things, about the appearings. How they stand to how things really are, well, that's, maybe we're going to be more skeptical about that. On the practical side, tryings are to doings as seemings are to beings. The possibility of a failure is the possibility that I didn't actually put the ball through the hoop. I only tried to. I only intended to. I only wanted to. But it doesn't make sense to say, well, are you sure you tried? Maybe you only tried to try. I mean, we can give that a use. If we think about athletic training and so on. No, you weren't really trying. But in the standard use of it, no, I know what I was trying to do. I succeeded in trying to do it, however ineffectual it was at actually doing it. But it was a deep mistake for Descartes to think of our knowledge of appearings as a kind of incorrigible knowledge. A deep mistake, not just a stupid mistake, that, articulated a whole way of thinking about things that it's taken us 300 years to work our way out of. And we learned a lot along the way, but it was a mistake. And it's a mistake, indeed, it's the same mistake, to think of tryings, volitions, willings, as minimal kinds of doings. Minimal, immediately doable things, willing, because the possibility of failing, merely trying to will, doesn't apply to them. And Sellers gave us what I think is the best diagnosis of the mistake on the cognitive side. He said, when I say the tower is square, and I can see that the tower is square, I'm doing two things. I'm exercising a reliable responsive disposition, and I'm endorsing a claim. I'm endorsing the claim that the tower is round. And when I say, or square, I'm sorry, I guess the thing is round towers look square if you can't see them well enough to get the depth perception. So when I say, oh, it turned out I was wrong, it merely looked square to me, it really was round when we rode up to it. The actual function of that looks talk or seems talk is not to report my knowledge of something incorrigible or an appearing. It's just to exercise that same disposition to call it square. But because I think maybe this isn't one of the cases where the RDRD is that reliable, to withhold the endorsement. The function of looks talk is to withhold the endorsement of the claim that one is expressing one's temptation to make. And so looks talk is parasitic on is talk. You have to be able to make the mistakes in order to make these other claims. And the incorrigibility is trivial. It's because you haven't endorsed any claim in making it. And those Sellers, for some reason, never talks about the practical case. There's an exactly analogous analysis available for tryings. When I say, well, I didn't put the ball through the hoop, but at least I tried. When the recruit says, well, I don't know whether it hit the bullseye, but I intended to hit the bullseye. I tried to hit the bullseye. At least I succeeded in that. Well, no, that isn't a doing that you succeed in. You're merely withholding the endorsement, the commitment to things being as you intended them to be. That's not a kind of doing, which has the puzzling feature that you can't fail to do it, unlike everything else. That's just to mistake the grammar. So Descartes had a picture where at the base of our knowledge, shaky though it may be, of the external world was our sure and certain, incorrigible knowledge of how things appeared to us, how they looked or seemed. And at the basis of our fallible capacity to intervene in the world was our indefeasible dominion over our own will, over our own acts of mind, which were then only causally connected to bodily movements and then the consequences of those bodily movements in the external world. So we ought to reject that picture. And I want to be clear, though endorsing that picture has been a permanent temptation to anybody who has the causal chain picture of practical agency. For instance, I think Kant is fully ensnared in it. It is a mistake. That's the wrong conception of what initiates these causal chains. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think it follows from a causal chain account that you have to think of the initiating events in these Cartesian terms. There is room for somebody to be a causal chain theorist, to have the pearl necklace picture of events as strung together without this mistaken conception of the initiating intention or mental event. But it's been very difficult for people to keep that out. And one of the things one is particularly liable to, if one has that version of the causal chain account, is to be an intentionalist in morals. To say, if you want to know, if you want to assess the moral value of a doing, assess the will. Because after that, it's not in the same sense in the control of the agent. Only really that willing, that trying is. And then you have, of course, the mirror image of that, the consequentialist, who says, well, no, the only proper subject of moral evaluation is the objective happening in the world. And you can be various varieties of consequentialists, but they said, what you intended is really neither here nor there. It's the objective event, the deed, is what we should look at morally. And it's going to be a consequence of Hegel's two perspectives view of the unity of this content, that both of those are one-sided, einseitig, monoperspectival views, and that both the, in Davidsonian terms, specifications under which the doing is intentional and the consequential specifications of it in terms of the content, those are both important for the moral evaluation. Indeed, we have to worry about the relations between them. So neither moral intentionalism nor moral consequentialism is going to be a tempting option if you have his picture of the unity. Now, in contemporary theory of agency, Davidson takes as his nemesis Jaegwon Kim, who thinks of my act of intending, however that's conceived, and the contraction of the muscles in my finger, thinks of the intending as one event that causes, we don't really know how, but presumably there's some neurophysiological intervention, causes the contraction of my finger, which causes, in a way we actually do understand pretty well, the closing of the circuit, the movement of the switch, the closing of the circuit, which again causes, in ways we understand pretty well, the light going on, and then the perception of the burglar. It alerts the burglar. Well, we understand some of that. And Davidson says that's completely the wrong way to think about what's going on in intentional agency. And the way he comes up with is very much the way Hegel did. And I will say, if I can wax autobiographical for a moment, in the summer of 1990, Bert Dreyfus had put on one of his NEH summer seminars, and this was second or third one I had been to. He always invited me to these things to coerce me into writing about Heidegger. He just thought I should be writing about Heidegger. This one was on Heidegger and Davidson, that brought together, Bert's Heideggerian people and Davidson, his colleague at Berkeley, and a bunch of Davidsonians, because he thought there was some analogy between them, or at least wanted a conversation. Davidson failed to find anything that moved him philosophically in anything any of the Heideggerians said. I dutifully had written a Heidegger piece for my lecture, but these summer seminars were 6 weeks long. In my seminar presentation, I talked about Davidson and Hegel on agency. And Davidson was fascinated. He saw his theory in the Hegel passages that I was talking about, and disappointed Dreyfus no end by saying, look, why are we talking about Heidegger here? There's actually some interesting stuff in Hegel. Why don't you do one of these things? On him. So Davidson himself was able to see these analogies, and was at least willing to entertain my claim that not only had Hegel seen this, but that Hegel had gone farther than Davidson had in these accounts. So if all of that makes some sense, the question one should ask is, well, what's the alternative to the pearl necklace causal chain account? And if we need a corresponding image to it, I'll say, well, think of the doing as an oak tree that you can approach by thinking about its roots, which are underground and not visible to others, and then the tree flourishing that you think of from its leaves and its branches, and so on. But it's one tree. And if you want to understand a tree, you've got to understand the relation between the parts that's under the ground and the parts that's above. But you've got to see them as parts of one thing. You can't get a tree like that by bolting together an underground part and then an above ground part. And Oh, here we can go back to the handout. The best part of this session, by the way, is going to be the handout. These passages are worth looking at, make up your own story about them. Here's the way I would epitomize Davidson's theory. He says, one and the same event can be characterized in many ways. One of the ways we can pick out an event is by its consequences. So when you ask me what I did, there's one thing that I did in his example. It can be described as contracting the muscles in my finger, or it can be described in terms of more or less distal consequences of that. But I'm describing one event. The event of my turning on the light and the event of my alerting the burglar, that was the same event. I've just specified that event in terms of consequences that that event had. He calls this the accordion effect, that even as the consequences keep rolling, maybe the startled burglar jumped out the window and was arrested. Well, then what I did when I flipped on the switch was cause the burglar's arrest. That's still specifying the same event. Kim thinks those are all different events that stand in causal relations to each other. But in fact, we're just using effects to specify the one same event. And that same event has some specifications under which it's intentional. So turning on the light was intentional. Alerting the burglar was not intentional. It's the same doing, the same action under all those descriptions. So whether something is an action or not is an extensional feature of it. That is, if it's a doing, if it's somebody's intentional doing, then it is under all of its descriptions. Extensional, it means description independent. But only some of the specifications are intentional, are ones that I had a reason to perform. So whether something is intentional, whether a description is intentional or not, well, that's specific to that description. The description turning on the light is one under which it's intentional, with a T now. The description alerting the burglar is one under which it is not intentional with a T. So being intentional with a T is intentional with an S. It's description relative. And his view about what makes it intentional is it resulted from, is rationalized by some sample bit of practical reasoning that appeals as premises to my beliefs and desires. And what makes something a doing, an extensional characterization of it, is that it's intentional with a T under some description. If it has any description under which it's intentional with a T, then it's an action under all of its descriptions. So Davidson says Kim is reifying these descriptions. He's mistaking them for actually different events in the world. And that's not the way we should think about them. In particular, Davidson says there need be no events that are intendings. There are just specifications of external events under which they're intentional. We don't need volitions, intendings, acts of mind in the picture. And Hegel's version of this, so I think Hegel has all of this. And if you look on the handout, his way of distinguishing these is to talk about the consequential specifications as the deed, der Tat, and the ones under which it's intentional as the Handlung, and corresponding to this Tat Handlung distinction will be an Absicht Vorsatz distinction, which I'll say some more about in a bit. But the point is, for him, those are all specifications of the same doing. And he turns the crank another time beyond Davidson and says, look, the difference between these is a normative difference, and it's a difference of social perspective. It's a question of who has the authority to specify the doing in these terms. And only the agent has the authority to specify it's being intentional. Under what description did you invest your authority in it? Did you commit yourself practically to do it? Well, I was trying to turn on the light. I didn't intend to cast a shadow of just this shape, though that's something I did too, but I didn't intend to do that. And I didn't intend to alert the burglar. Whereas any of us who happen to be passing by are equally authoritative about what the consequences were. You know, maybe the agent, maybe I as the agent never knew about the burglar at all. But the cop who saw him jump out, he was aware of the burglar and so is in a position authoritatively to characterize the one thing that I did as alerting the burglar, as well as turning on the light. And these for Hegel correspond to the distinction between the context of practical deliberation, when I'm deciding what to do, and the context of normative assessment of what's done. The agent and the agent who is taking responsibility for the doing under one set of specifications, and the recognitive community, those that the agent has authorized to hold him responsible, who are now in a position to characterize it under other descriptions than the agent herself. So it's a normative difference between the context of deliberation and the context of assessment. It's a difference of social perspective of the locus of authority and responsibility. We'll see, this is the to be the lesson of sort of part two of my presentation, that there's also a crucial distinction between what specifications are available prospectively, that's the Vorsatz, the content of the Vorsatz, and what's only available in principle retrospectively. That's what he calls the Absicht, where in the passages there we'll see him saying, you don't really know the content of the intention with which you performed it, the Absicht, until you see what you do. Well, yeah, maybe that's worth looking at here. So Yeah, the agent only gets to know his end from the deed. Well, his vocabulary slides around a little bit, but it's supposed to be Vorsatz, Absicht, Handlung, Tat. The deed does away with the inexpressibility of what is, sometimes he says, merely meant, the Vorsatz. Therefore, feelings of exaltation or lamentation or repentance are altogether out of place. For all that sort of thing stems from a mind which imagines a content and an in itself, which are different from the original nature of the individual and the actual carrying out of it in the real world. Whatever it is that the individual does and whatever happens to him, that he has done himself, and he is that himself. He can have only the consciousness of the simple transference of himself from the night of possibility into the daylight of the present, the actuality, from the abstract in itself into the significance of actual being. That is, if we properly understand what we're doing. The analysis of this being into intentions and subtleties of that sort, whereby the actual man, his deed, is to be explained away again in terms of a being that is only meant, just as the individual himself even may create for himself special intentions concerning his actuality. All this must be left to the laziness of mere conjecture. This is coming from his criticism of the pearl necklace. From what has now been said, we may learn what to think of a man who, when blamed for his shortcomings, or it may be his discreditable acts, appeals to the professedly excellent intentions and sentiments of the inner self he distinguishes therefrom. There certainly may be individual cases where the malice of outward circumstances frustrates well-meant designs and disturbs the execution of the best laid plans. But in general, even here, the essential unity between inward and outward is maintained. We are thus justified in saying that a man is what he does, and the lying vanity which consoles itself with the feeling of inward excellence may be confronted with the words of the gospel, by their fruits ye shall know them. That grand saying applies primarily in moral and religious aspects, but it also holds good in reference to performance in art and science. If a daub of a painter or a poetaster soothe themselves by the conceit that their head is full of high ideals, their consolation is a poor one. And if they insist on their being judged not by their actual works, but by their projects, we may safely reject their pretensions as unfounded and unmeaning. Let me just mention, this is going to be the sense in which the object, the intention, what you committed yourself to do, is something you actually only know when you've worked out the whole plan and see how it comes out, even though the Vorsatz, the Handlung, is something you have special authority about. I find it interesting, and I complain about this in the book, that people who have written about the question of whether the Phenomenology is the book Hegel set out intending to write, given that he originally had the title A Science of the Experience of Consciousness and sort of only projected it. Well, they never ask, what about on Hegel's view of intention? Did he write the book he intended to write? Because he's telling us here, that's the only book you can write, is the one you intended to write. We'll see after the break. I'll talk more about how this makes sense. But and I will say, this is one perspective. This is the retrospective perspective. This is the objective perspective, and it's compatible with the distinctive authority that the agent has. It wouldn't be a doing at all if there weren't specifications under which it was intentional, and those are the specifications that intentional, not now in the sense of Absicht, but of Vorsatz, that the agent has authority over. So I've suggested two framings for thinking about Hegel in Hegel's theory of agency. The large one is between two sorts of approaches to agency, the pearl necklace and the oak tree, the causal chain of distinct events, and the two aspects of one unified occurrence or process, the two forms in which one content can appear, picture, which we see contrasting on the one hand Kant as in many ways Cartesian in his account of agency, and Hegel saying, look, this way of thinking that it's the way the empiricists think about agency, this causal chain of separate events, this is inevitably going to end up with you being a riddle to yourself, unable to see the unity between the doing as mine, as my doing, and as an objective event in the world, sort of available to everybody. Ultimately, that's a normative status. It's a product of recognitive attitudes. And I'm claiming that same contrast we see with Davidson, the good guy, looking at Kim, and Kim is speaking for basically the 20th century picture of agency. If Hegel is right, Kim and Davidson mislocated the source of their disagreement because they thought they disagreed about how to individuate events. Kim doesn't actually care much about agency. It's just a special case for him. He claims that specifications of striking the billiard ball with the cue, striking the cue ball with the cue ball striking the 8-ball, the 8-ball going in the pocket. Those are all separate events. Davidson says, no, they're all one event specified in terms of consequences, whether those are doings or not. Hegel is talking just about doings, just about, well, events isn't right for him. As I say, it's processes that he cares about, but the important distinctions only apply to doings. Maybe they're reflected in other kinds of events, but the disagreement that matters is about events or processes. Some events, Davidson is perfectly happy to talk about World War II as an event, even though it isn't the paradigm of an event for him. They thought they were talking about the metaphysics of events. Hegel insists we've got to think about the metaphysics of agency, and the metaphysics of events only matters insofar as it bears on that. So I set up this general opposition with Hegel and Davidson as, well, I say the good guys. Obviously, I'm thinking there's sort of more to their account that I'm sympathetic to that. But at any rate, as having a worked out alternative to the sort of common sense, originally Cartesian picture. And so this is a basis on which Hegel is to Kant as Davidson is to Kim, even in their different time periods. But I also suggested that a difference between the contemporary Anglophone setting and the setting in German idealism is what's the problem? Where for Hegel, it's about the unity and disparity that agency essentially involves. And then what are the paradigm doings? Are they these extended processes, extended doings, of which we can get limiting cases? Walking to the bank, going to class is a being on your way to class. What are you doing? I'm going to class. That's a sort of limited case of a doing, and so is flipping the switch. But you want to look at these umphier writings of a book, buildings of a house, sorts of cases. So that's the structure in which I've sought to locate these differences. And so far, I've suggested that the surplus that Hegel is bringing to what Davidson has given us eyes to see in Hegel's account of agency are his different rendering of the distinction between the specifications under which and in virtue of which the doing is my doing, and the specifications under which it is an objective occurrence in the world, the consequential specifications, in normative terms of authority and responsibility, and in terms of the difference of social perspective between the one undertaking the commitment and the ones attributing it. And as I say in the second part, I want to elaborate on that distinction. Questions or comments at this point? Yeah, Katja.
Yeah, thank you. One reason, in regards to meaning of claims, one reason for the perspectivity for the social perspectivity was the non-monotonicity of material inferences. So, and now it seems that Hegel is claiming also a kind of non-monotonicity when it comes to events or to deeds. But cannot we say that there is some kind of monotonicity in the realm of deeds, because there is something like causality?
I'm not sure what to say about that. I think the closest thing is the way in which Hegel will talk about the evolution of an intention, the evolution of the content. The intention is, as the object is his name for the content of the deed. And that's why it isn't determinate until you finish doing whatever it is you're doing. And in the case where the effects run out to the infinite future, that content is still evolving. Monotonicity is about the effect of collateral commitments on that content, and he has a distinctive picture of it. I suppose I want to say the monotonicity goes sort of all the way down in it, that you can't get away from it. But it may be that we're oversimplifying things to think in terms of monotonicity, given his holistic framework. Yeah.
Thank you.
James, were you? No, okay. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question before?
Please, Elena.
I just want to make sure I understand the Vorsatz-Absicht distinction, specifically which features it is that kind of fall under the, or an action has in virtue insofar as there's a Vorsatz, and which features as far as we're talking about the Absicht. So, like with the Davidson's example with the turning on the light, so it's my purpose to turn on the light, and then the actual fact that I'm switching it on, is that now part of the Absicht? So is the purpose just kind of what I would say, my knowledge, how I would symbolically represent it, and the Absicht's the actual thing in the world? Is that? But then also the fact that I've alerted the burglar is also supposed to be part of the Absicht.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I will have more to say about this, but in the one passage we saw, he says, in effect, it's the modern insight that we distinguish between the sense in which we hold someone responsible for what they did on purpose, for what they meant to be doing, than from the doing under all of its other descriptions. So they have a right to be held responsible only for the Handlung. He wants to say that this is the part that was meant, where if you asked, what did you mean to do? You would have answered by articulating your Vorsatz, the purpose with which you did it. So that distinction isn't going to go away. The Absicht is the content of the deed, the content of what was done. And what makes it a doing is that the Vorsatz is part of that content. But what you did, that the Absicht is the content of, that runs beyond what you would announce as your purpose prospectively. I don't know if that's helpful. It's entirely up to you what you meant to do, what your purpose was, what your Vorsatz was. That's your authority. That makes you responsible for more than that, though, in the sense of opening you up to be held responsible by those you recognize as having the right to hold you responsible. They can hold you responsible in a broader sense for the entire deed. And we'll see, sort of as we get to the end of the book, that he thinks the fact that we make this, the fact that we carve off, and he thinks the modern notion is that you're only responsible for the Handlung, for what you meant to be doing. And he thinks that's an expression of alienation, of our being a riddle to ourselves. And that the ancient heroic view that Oedipus is the poster child for, in which you're responsible for all the descriptions, for what you did under all the descriptions of it, including the ones you did not, in our sense, intend. They were not intentional. It was not intentional under them. He thinks that's something to be recovered. And in the postmodern stage, we're supposed to get to doing that. It's just that who's responsible for the whole doing now expands from the agent to all of us. We're all responsible for what each of us does. And this is not a story that comes up in the reason section, but that's sort of where we're going. So, he's describing a content, the object that is a unity that is the content that's common to the doing as it appears to the agent prospectively, and the doing as it appears to the community that sees its consequences retrospectively. But it only is what it is because of those two perspectives. It only is a deed because there is the perspective under which it was meant, intended, purposed. And we've got to see sort of what that unity and how it essentially involves that disparity is. And one of the troubles with the account of agency in the philosophy of right is that he only articulates the alienated modern conception there. He doesn't look back to the heroic ancient one or forward to the reachievement of a version of that, which will incorporate the disparity and will keep what was right about the modern conception. So I shouldn't talk about the postmodern one. That's a topic for later on. But I will say some more about this puzzling notion of the intent, the object, the sense in which it's only settled afterwards. I will say some more about that. So anyway, that's not supposed to be clear yet.
But like the alerting the burglar in Davidson's example, that would be part of the Absicht, of the intention.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it might sound odd.
So
I guess if we're not careful about the distinguishing the way that we often use intention to mean the
yes,
purpose.
But I mean, here's the key point. I mean, I don't want to be mysterious about this. Suppose the colonel in charge of the military unit orders the captain to take his company, or whatever it is that captains are in charge of, to take his soldiers across the river in the next 24 hours. That's the actual content of the order that he wrote down. That corresponds to the Vorsatz, except in this second or third personal sense. It's an order rather than an intention. And the colonel comes back the next day, and indeed all the soldiers are on the other side of the river, but the captain has had them fell 100 trees in order to make the bridge to go across there. And the colonel says, look, I told you to go across the river. It wasn't part of the content of my order that you should cut down all these trees. I'm unhappy about that. Well, the captain has a right to say, no, there's a sense in which that was part of the content of your order. Because in the concrete circumstances in which we were doing it, the only way to get the soldiers across the river in 24 hours was to cut down all those trees. Now, it's true, you didn't know that that was the only way to do it, but that was part of the content of your order, whether you knew it or not, given the concrete circumstances in which the order needed to be carried out. Well, then there's a sense in which even the colonel didn't know what the content of his order was until it was carried out, because he didn't know in the concrete circumstances what it involved, what it required, what the evolution of the plan would have to be when it incorporated all the concrete circumstances. So the sense in which the object is the content of the doing, and in which it makes sense to think of it as the content of your intention, as something that can in principle only be known even by you after the deed has been performed. That's that same sense of content in which we say, well, the content of the colonel's order was not just the part he could write down and had envisaged, but in a very real sense, the content of his order included doing these things that he didn't foresee and indeed couldn't have foreseen. And I think that there is an intelligible sense of the order. If, for instance, he brought the captain up on charges for having done things he hadn't been ordered to do, it's an appropriate defense of the captain to say, no, I just did what you ordered me to do. And I say the disparity that agency necessarily involves, you can never do just what you purposed, what you meant, what you intended. You can never just turn on the light, just throw the ball through the hoop. You always do a lot of other stuff too. You turn on the light, you cast shadows of particular shapes, and so on. The ball going through the hoop disturbs the air in various ways. You may well do less. Maybe the light doesn't go on because the switch is disconnected or the electricity's off. Maybe the ball doesn't go through the hoop. But whether or not you do less, you always do more. And those are part of the content of the doing in the sense in which the object is articulating it. Well, let's take our break. I have it's 3 minutes after the hour. Let's come back at 15 minutes after the hour at 3:15. Okay. Well, I want to say some more about just the topic we were talking about before the break. And I said the discussion of this last part is in 3 parts. I want to talk about the cycle of perception and action, the plan structure of doings, and then this is a semantic model and a model for cognition, for the relation between how things are for consciousness and how they are in themselves generally, including in the cognitive case. And this emphasis on the cycle of perception and action, I said this, he's now conceiving what he introduced to us originally in the introduction as the experience of error in a way that incorporates a practical dimension as well as a cognitive. He's thinking about finding ourselves in a situation, perceiving the situation we're in, thinking about it, intervening, doing something, acting, and then perceiving the result of that action and doing something else, perceiving the result of that and doing something else. This is something I think though it's in a way anachronistic to attribute this to him, it's a cybernetic test, operate, test, exit cycle. You check whether a condition obtains, do something to try and get that result, check whether it obtains. If it does, then you're done. If it doesn't, you do something else and go on. John Dewey, in his first papers. It was first known for his paper on the concept of the reflex arc, and used his reading of Hegel to give an interpretation of the reflex arc notion of a cycle that included afferent and efferent neural pathways in the years just before 1900. A tote cycle here. This is the structure that he's now thinking of practical agency in terms of. This is the aspect that gets left out if you're just thinking about flipping the switch as your or raising your arm as the paradigmatic doing, because it doesn't have the element of sort of seeing how close you got or how well what you tried worked and adjusting what you try for the next time. Whereas if you think about something like writing a book or building a house, this becomes apparent. And I think it does even in the case of the colonel ordering the soldiers across, ordering the captain to take the soldiers across the river. Unfortunately, it comes out maybe a little more clearly in an example of building the house, which I know nothing about, as opposed to the case of writing a book, which I actually do know something about. But if you think about the initial purpose as codified in a set of plans, okay, this is the house we're going to build. It's specifying the structure, it's specifying the materials, and so on. It breaks down into smaller bits, but it requires adjustment and accommodation along the way. So in order to make the doorway, which was part of the plan, as I'm beginning to implement it, and I need to seat the sill. And when this was first raised to me, I thought, well, we'll glue it. But I see I've done a couple of these now, and I see that as the temperature changes, the wood warps a little bit, and that's not good. The glue it isn't maintaining its contact. We should nail these sills down. That will deal with the temperature changes better. Now, what I'm doing is sort of trying something. I glued some of them and saw the result, and well, it didn't work as well as I wanted. So I shift what I'm doing and nail them instead of gluing them. That's a test, operate, test, exit, a tote cycle. And if you think about actually building the house and all of the adjustments that are necessary, well, we couldn't get that tile that was specified in the size that was originally specified. So we had to either go with some other tile in the same size or adjust and make it with a different size tile. Well, this is an alteration of the plans. It's not exactly what was written there, but it's also the actualization of the plans given the actual circumstances that one is working in. And Hegel wants us to think about that evolution of the plan as it's got a structure with subtasks in it, and the subtasks have subtasks and so on. I'm doing the sill as part of doing the doorway, which is part of doing this facade of the house. And sometimes some of the subtasks or even the subtasks are better done in some other way than the original plan. Not possible to do it that way here. And the adjustments I make in sort of how I do this may affect what the best way to do the other plan is. Always the structure is this cycle of perceiving the situation, intervening in some way, perceiving the results of the intervention, assessing that relative to the goal or the sub-goal or the sub-sub-goal that one's got, and adjusting it again. I think about the, clearly here, the actual effects, the consequential descriptions are affecting the intentional descriptions sort of at the micro level. I mean, Jasper Johns, the visual artist, when asked, well, how do you produce an original work of art? His famous formula for this, he says, take an object, do something to it, and look at it. And then do something else to it, and look at it again. And then, well, you probably throw it away because what you got wasn't worth anything. But in some of these, you look at it, do something, look at it, do something, and you get something interesting, and then you keep it, and that's art. Well, he's pretending that sort of all of it is in the assessment. He says, I have the artist's eye. It's as though he were doing random things to objects, but had a view about when this was getting closer to something interesting and when it finally was something interesting. And that was the particular conceit he was pushing. But I take it the point he was making was, well, you don't sit down with a full-blown intent in all the details of what you're going to produce. It's a process in which your judgment at each stage that something more needs to be done is as important, at least, as your judgment about what to do, what to try next. In the limit, maybe it could just be the selection, but these things interact. And Hegel is thinking of the Absicht. I'll call it intention, though. Remember, that's not the sense in which some specifications of the doing are intentional for Davidson, intentional with a T for Davidson. That has to do with the Vorsatz, the purpose. But actualizing that purpose involves going through this cycle of perception and action many times in this plan structured thing and at many different levels of embedding and scale of sort of in order to do. It's plan structured because there's subtasks and they have subtasks and so on. And all of this is both the further, from one point of view, the further determination of the intention, the content of the doing, and the actualization of it. Those are two ways of talking about the same thing. You're making it more determinate, and only at the end of the process, looking back, will one be able to say concretely what the intention was, what the content of this doing was, which the original set of plans, the Vorsatz, that was a genuine perspective on this content, as indeed are various consequences that were done along the way that were not sort of in aid of what one was doing. But this process of making more concrete, of actualizing the intention is, on the one hand, finding out what the content of the intention is, and on the other hand, making it definite. Again, you're taking the immediacies that you perceive and mediating them, incorporating them into the plan, mediating the immediate. That's how you make the abstract initial sketch that was the purpose, that was the plans, determinate and actual, is by incorporating these things. Well, these things don't fit. Now, the plan presupposed that those would fit. Now, what are we going to do about that so as to fulfill the next in order to out in the plan structure? At the end, one finds out what was required to implement the plans, and in that sense, what content was abstractly and prospectively specified by the plans, given that you were going to build the house here. So he's thinking of the intention in the way one thinks about the content of the command that the colonel gave to the captain. Difference between second person and first person doesn't matter here. It is considerations like this that lead contemporary theorists like David Velleman to think of intentions as only retrospectively imputable to actions. And he's not looking over his shoulder at Hegel, but it's the same sort of considerations that are leading him to that. This is how you find out what the content of your intention is, by doing it, in the same way that the colonel didn't really know what the content of his order was. He only had an abstract picture. That's what the content was for him. But what it turned out to be in itself, you couldn't know until you saw what was required to actually carry it out. Yeah, Paolo.
Yeah. Is the tote cycle to practical reason what the hermeneutic circle is to theoretical reason?
Well, it's an interesting thought. I mean, the hermeneutic circle doesn't sort of, as Dilthey laid it down for us, incorporate perception in it. It's sort of text all the way down. So there's, we would need to modify the picture of the hermeneutic circle in, I don't know, to take account of that. I mean, if we think about the sort of converse hermeneutic circle that's involved in writing the book, okay, so you have a conception of the whole that you're trying to do, and the subtasks are maybe the chapters of it, and then the sections, you have a plan for each one of those. And then you actually write one of them. Well, now you have the question, I look at it with Jasper Johns, is this one of the ones I throw out, or is there something I can do to this bit of text that will make it, more adequately perform the function that I'm imagining it, that I'm projecting it, playing in the whole? But as I actually produce this text, I'm also changing the conception that I have of the whole, because now it's going to incorporate this bit is in it instead of the merely abstract, something along these lines needs to be said. So there is a sort of converse hermeneutic circle where each bit of the part that I actually do changes the conception of the whole, which changes the assessment of each of the parts, and so on.
Yeah, that's where I was seeing the analogy.
Okay, so I mean, it's not. I'm not sure what the converse of the hermeneutic when you're producing the text as opposed to merely interpreting it is, I suppose if you have my view, you say, oh, well, that merely passive hermeneutic picture, that's einseitig. Actually, reading is rewriting, and there's just one hermeneutic thing you do, which can be sort of heavier on the writing side or heavier on the reading side, but really those are extremes of one textual enterprise. I suppose that's the view that I would say. Then I would say, yes, that's exactly what we've got. I mean, the way I was pitching it is he gives us a picture in the introduction of the experience of error as giving us the distinction between, as being as it were, practical origin of the distinction between what things are in themselves and what they are for me. When I realize that I got things wrong, the stick is really straight, and the commitment to the stick being bent changes status for me from being to me how the stick is in itself to being to me only how the stick was for me. That experience of cognitive error enforcing this distinction. Now, when we incorporate the practical failure, so I had the plan, but using the glue wouldn't fasten the sill to the stoop. Had to make a new plan, and in the tote cycle, that is the cycle of perception and action, you've got both errors and failures. Perceptual errors. Oh, I thought this was solid, and it turned out it wasn't. That was a cognitive error, a perceptual error. Oh, I thought I'd attached it, but that this would attach it, but that failed. We've got both of them. That's the way I was thinking about it, and taking the full thing as the model from which we should understand the cognitive, then as an abstraction from that, as a principal dimension of Hegel's pragmatism, of taking the practical as the model for the cognitive here. And I mean, the idea of that, I haven't really said anything about that, but the idea is that the way in which immediacy is incorporated in what I do when I'm building the house, the way the recalcitrance of the raw materials or the incapacity of the tools or of my use of the tools gets incorporated in sort of solving the problems and getting a house built. That's supposed to be a model for the way in which the recalcitrance of the way things objectively are in themselves, manifested in cognitive error and practical failure as aspects of this cycle of perception and action, alter my conceptions of things, make my conceptions more determinate. And that's the model for the determination of conceptual content, what corresponds to sharpening the boundaries of the concepts in the purely cognitive case. This is what we have in the case that's broadened to include the practical. I mean, I think we saw in the discussion of sense certainty the way in which one of the immediate deliverances of sense could be held onto anaphorically by using a demonstrative or an indexical that we could then secure and repeat, recollect anaphorically. See the analog here, where when I built the house, I can say, that's what I intended. I intended to build this house. And now there's a sense in which this house that I built is more determinate than sort of I knew going in. And yet, that plan is sort of anaphorically linked now to the thing that got produced. It was a plan for this house. That's the sense in which, now this is, as it were, backwards anaphora. I think in my discussion of anaphora and making it explicit, I quote this passage in Henry James that starts off using anaphors. He says, he was frightened by this, and so on. And it's like a page and a half later that we get the anchor for the anaphor. We've been hearing all about this guy's attitudes before we actually knew who he was. Backwards anaphora. That's sort of what we've got here. The Vorsatz, the purpose, ends up anaphorically anchored to something that doesn't exist at the time of the Vorsatz, and yet refers to it, is going to inherit its content from that anaphoric antecedent, so that we can say, this doing, you see what happened here? That's what I intended. This doing, I did this, I can say. And that it's a doing and not just a happening depends on there being this kind of connection to the purposing that I had, the description under which I meant to do it. But it's being an objective item in the world, a happening, as well as a doing, an actual occurrence. Well, that depends on its being the result of this process that was gone through. And a Hegelian looking at contemporary Anglophone theory of agency says, look, you've squashed all of this out of the picture. You've left all of this development of the plan through the cycle of perception and action. You've squashed all of that out if you're just thinking about me flipping a switch or raising my arm as the doing, rather than my playing a set of tennis as the doing, or one of these. So remember, the claim is that Hegel's picture is of the way the disparity and the unity are to be reconciled is hylomorphic. He says there's two forms that one content can take. There's the prospective perspective on it by the agent whose doing it is in virtue of its being their commitment that was actualized. They're taking responsibility for it, throwing this anaphoric line out to hook something that hasn't happened yet. What they're taking responsibility for, they don't know and can't know in detail at that point, but they have genuine authority about it. It is their doing, initiated by their practical acknowledgement of this commitment. And then there's the public perspective available to the community, to the audience, but retrospectively available, recollectively, rationally reconstructing the content that was genuinely the content intended, even if you didn't know it, even if you couldn't know it. And he wants us to use that model for the relation between our conceptions as what things are for consciousness and the real concepts that articulate in an alethic key that articulate the things out there, the facts and the necessary connections among them that are really there. They're recollectively recovered from this process in the same way in which an intention, the content of the intention, is recollectively, rationally reconstructed. Is a product of a rational reconstruction of this evolution of a plan-structured intention through the nested instantiations of the cycle of perception and action. So remember, one of the ways I put this was Hegel thought you're not going to understand the relation between the subjective and objective poles of the intentional nexus. I'll put it to try and put it as neutrally as possible by thinking of them as things that could be what they are and are intelligible as what they are independently of one another, and then in the image bolting them together. Here we're thinking about the pearl necklace version of practical agency as doing that. You've got to think of the unity that is there in successful cognition and in veridical cognition and successful actions, and abstract these aspects from it, the subjective and the objective, which he's understanding in terms of different social loci of authority over them, the agent having authority over the purpose, and the community over the consequential specifications of the very same content. There's what's available prospectively and what's available only retrospectively, and it is what it is as something that essentially has all those aspects. And this is as true of ultimately unsuccessful doings as it is of ultimately successful ones. That difference doesn't change this feature of them. And in chapter 12 of A Spirit of Trust, I go through in some detail the versions of the Hegelian versions of notions of sense and reference that come out if you understand them in terms of this process. This is what leads Hegel to call what he's doing a phenomenology. We're looking at the various appearances, the sequence of appearances of what things are for consciousness, now thinking of it as having this rich structure of plan-structured cycles within cycles of perception and action, and thinking of that as the process in which things appear, but in which prior appearances are discarded as in error or failing at different stages in the cycle of, in some cycle of perception and action. Oh, I missaw what that was when I was, I thought those were firmly attached, but they weren't. Or I thought doing this would firmly attach them, and it didn't. So there's a myriad of those. But the notion of what's really there is the notion of what plays a certain role when you rationally reconstruct, retrospectively reconstruct this process. The referent, the noumenon, well, that's the one that you end up where you are right now, socially and in particular historically, endorsing, knowing that as the consequences roll on, this one won't be maintainable in all of its details. You'll discover that there are errors or failures incorporated in it. But nonetheless, this is what to you is what things are in themselves, including what you're doing is in itself. It's not a Fregean picture in that it's essential for Frege that the senses and references and reference are different kinds of things, whereas it's essential for Hegel that they're all the same kind of thing. They're all conceptually articulated, modulo these differences in loci of authority and responsibility. And Hegel is holistic about these contents. They have the contents they do both in relation to each other, to other such contents, and they essentially have multiple social perspectives on them, from the one who's applying them and the ones who are assessing the results of applying it as being in error or a failure, and necessarily have these prospective and retrospective perspectives on them. And furthermore, Frege thinks both the referent and the sense and the senses are always already perfectly sharp and determinate in their boundaries, whereas Hegel thinks what there is this process of determination, which viewed retrospectively is the process of finding out what they always already were, but prospectively is the process of shaping them, of making them more definite, where the paradigm of doing that is the sort of practical undertaking that actualizes the plans for the house into a real house. And the reason I say this chapter is the beating heart of the book is this is what we've been building up to. And now he's assembled all the raw materials that he needs to tell us, how we should think about the determinate conceptual contents that we deploy. And the passages about truth as a vast bacchanalian revel with not a soul sober in the preface is what he's using, referring to what we're supposed to be able to understand now. And it's this understanding that he's going to assume in his readers as we look at the history of normative structures in the Spirit chapter, which was what it occurred to him to write next. Yes, Quinn.
Given the way that you characterize this paradigmatic notion of action, would it be more correct, or not more correct, but would it be correct to say that for Hegel, the actual paradigmatic case of action would be the practice of modifying our understanding of our authorities and our responsibilities intersubjectively?
Well, Yes, because that's that's a structure that's in play in whatever discursive activity we engage in. I mean, I think the paradigm for him is the practice of science, understood as including the technology. He would see it as a mistake to abstract the theoretical, cognitive, sort of contemplative side from the practical intervention, the technological implementation of these theories. I mean, we're talking about a philosopher who never saw a railroad engine. Last generation before the Industrial Revolution made the scientific revolution actual and practically significant. And yet, this is the view that he has, that without that practical aspect, we haven't actualized the concepts. This is something that essentially 100 years later, the American pragmatists would be in a position to look at the triumph of science, the scientific revolution being completed by the Industrial Revolution, and in Peirce's image that was taken up by James and Dewey, then that the image of knowledge should not be the telescope, but the flywheel governor that regulates a steam engine that precisely involves a cycle, a tote cycle, where as the pressure gets higher, it spins the spindle faster, which raises the flywheels, which then are used to damp down the fire and lower the pressure. They said the model of knowledge is like the flywheel governor, not like the telescope. Well, that's a Hegelian thought. James.
Please forgive me for my slight disorientation in this material, but I want to ask you a question about your reading of Hegel. So on your reading, I'm wondering what becomes of the distinction between agent and world. And I ask because one sort of going candidate for that distinction seems to be made unavailable. So you might, on one view, the agent is sort of delineated by means of autonomy, and that's to say, by taking something as the capacity to take something as an end. But on this view, it seems like it's as if one's ends are opaque until after actions are complete. It's like ends are made determinate, they're made what they are by worldly facts. And that seems to threaten that, it certainly threatens that conception of autonomy. It makes it unavailable, it seems. So one way of drawing the lines around what counts as me, namely that I select my ends self-consciously in advance, that notion of the will seems to go by the wayside. But by the same token, it seems as if I might be committed to a view where I and the world merge somehow, because my ends, objectively described, are things that include parts of my objective determinations of how the world are. So is there an alternative conception available of my distinctness from the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the task becomes one of separating your perspective out of it, out of what is a unity in the doings. But first of all, it isn't true that your ends are completely opaque to you. You have a genuine perspective on them. It's just that in addition to the abstract description you could give of what you're trying to do, it corresponds to the plans for the house, which, though imperfect, can be plans for the very house that is produced. They're a view of it. That in addition to that, there is that line with that anaphoric line with the demonstrative hook on it that's thrown out into the future to hook onto that actual house as the one you intended to build, and which is to that extent opaque to you. There is no opacity in it. There's a difference. So we have to sort of carve you out of this. And of course, there is, and you're quite right that the picture of Kantian autonomy, the Kantian picture of autonomy that Hegel criticizes as incorporating the notion as being an instance of pure independence, where it's got to be totally up to me for it to be intelligible that it's up to me at all, which is why he thinks Kant can't adequately get in one view the sense in which what I actually do is my doing, and the sense in which it's an objective occurrence in the world, but has to contract the picture of me down, me and my doings down to my willings. Well, but we saw that Hegel's recognitive model is a development of the autonomy model that keeps a notion of independence, authority that's balanced by dependence. So it's not a notion of pure independence. What the world can't do is do things, take responsibility for them. A responsibility whose content is not entirely up to the one who is taking on that responsibility. That's the picture we've got to get beyond, is the idea that if it isn't completely up to you what responsibility you're taking on, then you're not genuinely taking it on, and you're not genuinely responsible for what's done. And you say, well, no, that's not true. You can only act in a recognitive community that can hold you responsible for this doing that outruns what you could know, or in that sense, purpose, what could be part of your Vorsatz, but you can genuinely take responsibility for it because you've authorized them to hold you responsible for not just your conception of it, but for what you actually do. And the world is just the arena for that. It's not one of the players. But we see that intentional agency is a normative matter, and so a recognitive matter, and so a social and historical matter. And the world is, the ink in your pen and the paints on the canvas. I mean, the world as it is, the immediacy of the world is those things. Okay. Well, we're at a dividing point in the book because these different threads, as he said, the treatment of cognition in the consciousness section, of normativity, selfhood, and community in the self-consciousness section, and now of practical agency in the reason chapter. Those aspects of discursive activity, which we've considered separately, are all going to be tied up into a bundle, and we'll look at the history of Geist and of us normative creatures, really the history of the structure of normativity in 3 parts in the spirit section. And let me remind you in housekeeping terms that there isn't a class next week. I have to be lecturing at this very time in Leipzig. Wish I were really going to do it in Leipzig, but that is not to be. But the conference forbids me from doing this. So there's some time to catch up on some of the reading. If, gasp, you're not completely on top of the vast amount of material that I've made available. And when we come back in 2 weeks, we'll look at Hegel's account of Geist in the age of the golden age of Greece. So I will see you then and there.